Lariette, realizing the situation, thought it might be better to go home, but the man assured her everything was fine. The main character was surprised, as they could easily attract unwanted attention. She asked again if things were really okay, and he smiled, replying that everything was perfect because his beloved was with him. When they arrived at the masquerade, Lariette noticed it was different from a formal ball, much freer and more joyous. Smiling, she pulled Asher to dance with her, and he, smiling back, couldn't believe such a day had come. Without the stench of decaying corpses, without people staring at him with fear and disgust, and without feeling like an outsider, as Duke Candle once did. Lariette had given him a new life, an opportunity to live as a normal person and not as a monster. He never imagined he could dance in front of others, and even though his dancing was clumsy, Lariette looked at him with such love that he couldn't comprehend how he could not love her back. Gazing into Asher's eyes, Lariette smiled sweetly and confessed her love. The Duke, filled with emotion, told her he loved her too. They stood together under the fireworks, savouring the moment. When Asher leaned in to kiss her, Lariette playfully covered his mouth, saying they couldn't kiss in public. Asher, closing his eyes, kissed her hand instead, and looked at her with embarrassed eyes. Lariette, blushing, asked indignantly what he was doing, making him worry that she didn't like it. In truth, all she could think about was how soft his lips were. Turning to him, Lariette explained that she didn't dislike it at all. Gently rubbing her hand, Asher asked if he could kiss her on the lips instead. Though she enjoyed the attention, Lariette decided to tease him and, making eyes at the Duke, provocatively asked if he wanted to sleep with her. At her words, Asher froze, his mind racing through different interpretations of sleep, until he was left speechless. Lariette grinned and teasingly noted that Asher could only kiss her, calling him shameless. Asher stammered, blushing, but before he could respond, she placed a finger on his lips and declared there would be no more kisses for a while. Asher was horrified at such a punishment. The next day, as Duke Candle was dressing, he asked Lariette if she planned to kiss him today. Lariette, hanging lazily from the bed, didn't understand what he meant at first. He was referring to the daily kisses she would give him, boosting his confidence. Embarrassed, Asher finally asked, hiding his face in shame, if she would call him handsome and kiss him today. Without hesitation, she replied, no, which shocked him. Peeking out from under the blanket, Lariette reminded him of the punishment they discussed the night before. Duke Candle was stunned, thinking she must be joking, but Lariette explained she was absolutely serious. A bit nervous, Asher promised not to kiss her in public again, but Lariette remained firm in her resolve. Then, with a sad look, Asher sat down opposite her and asked if she really wasn't going to kiss him. Slowly, he leaned in towards her lips. But Lariette, blushing, stopped him with her hand, explaining that the kiss ban applied here too. The Duke was incredulous that he was truly forbidden from kissing her. Lariette, smiling, repeated her words and wished him a safe journey. As he left, his mood noticeably deflated, Lariette broke into a sly smile, thinking how endearing it was that the Duke, like a little child, was begging for her kisses. And it would be that way for several days. A few hours later, Lariette met with Doha, who immediately noticed how happy she looked. Unable to contain herself, she eagerly boasted about how wonderful her date with Essa was, all thanks to Doha's recommendations. Listening to this, the priest grew increasingly irritated, as he felt he should have been the one on a date with her. To avoid hearing more, he hastily suggested they start training. Suddenly, Lariette remembered a strange man she had met at the festival, which she reported to Doha. She explained that an unexpected man from the West had confessed to her, and she found him quite odd. The priest, curious, asked what exactly he had confessed. Lariette, turning away slightly embarrassed, revealed that the stranger had confessed his love to her the previous day. Then, smiling, she joked that it must have been due to her unearthly beauty. However, when she saw that Doha didn't smile and looked at her as though she were foolish, she realized the joke had fallen flat. Doha, however, couldn't figure out why he suddenly felt so irritated. He questioned himself. Was it because some rogue had dared to confess to Lariette? At that moment she gave him a strange look, but then he smiled and confirmed that she was indeed very beautiful. Trying to move on, Doha looked around and asked if Lariette planned to turn the place into ruins today, as she had the last time. The girl quickly replied that he was mistaken, and then he suggested they move on from the basics of magic and focus on practice. Hearing this, Larette's excitement was palpable. Like an eager puppy, she asked joyfully what they would do this time. Doha replied that she would have to learn the simplest things. Lariette began to think about different possibilities. Perhaps an attack, an escape, or a form of control. However, Doha had something else in mind. He was going to teach her how to kill. Upon hearing this, Lariette froze. The priest grabbed her wrist and, with a cold demeanor, explained that if she used her magic and pointed it directly at someone's chest, she would instantly kill them. Lariette, looking at him with confused eyes, couldn't comprehend what he was telling her. His eyes gleamed with a predatory cunning as he faintly smiled and then challenged her to kill him. Taken aback by his words, Lariette, now serious, told him that his joke was far from funny. But Doha wasn't joking. To make her act, he tried to push her further, but she shoved him away with both hands, shouting at him to stop. Trembling, she couldn't understand why he treated his life so carelessly. She thought about how much she wanted to live, even though her time was so short, and only now did her will to survive become clear. Hanging her head and clenching her fists in anger, Lariette realized she was jealous. Unhappy with herself and upset by how easily Doha regarded his own life. He, on the other hand, looked at her thoughtfully before asking her what it was she truly wanted. Lariette admitted that she wanted to be able to move around freely, without needing an escort, and to explore different places on her own. Doha, with a knowing grin, tried to explain that the streets wouldn't be kind to her. Recalling his own childhood, he warned that if she left the capital, she would become a target for those looking to exploit her. Gazing intently into her eyes, he bent slightly closer and told her that if she didn't face her enemies with the determination to kill, she would be the one who perished. Lariette understood that she wanted to go on one last journey before she died, but with only 3 months to live, she had no desire to be killed by anyone else. Before all this, Lariette had other thoughts weighing on her mind. She not only wanted to learn how to protect herself, but also feared her family might try to kidnap her again. Since Lariette had decided to go on a trip just before her death, she knew she couldn't tell anyone about it. It was clear to her that the streets would never show her mercy and that she might have to hurt someone in self-defense. With this in mind, the girl thanked Doha for his valuable advice. Doha, on the other hand, believed he could only protect Lariette while she was next to him. The thought of her being in danger while out of his sight disturbed him, which was why he expressed himself so harshly. Yet he knew she would understand his intentions. Holding her wrist, the high priest urged her to attack him again, this time with the intent to kill. Lariette closed her eyes, letting out a quiet sigh, but Doha reassured her with a smile. He reminded her that he wasn't as helpless as she might think. He was strong, and if he were injured, she could always heal him. Still, Lariette worried about hurting him. Meanwhile, Doha felt a strange, piercing sensation every time he saw the concern on her face. He couldn't fully understand what these emotions meant or why they arose within him. Waving his hand dismissively, Doha told her there was no time for meaningless conversation. In his hand appeared an unusual object resembling a folded fan. Smirking, he pointed it at her and instructed her to stop him by attacking. Though he didn't hit her hard, Lariette was unable to block any of his blows, and it began to irritate her. The next time she managed to dodge one of his strikes by moving to the right, but Doha quickly adjusted his position and hit her on the arm. Smiling, he asked if magic was a joke to her, since she hadn't used it. Determined to prove herself, Lariette quickly recalled a spell that wouldn't cause harm. She decided to use the water element to fend him off and show what she could do. Dodo was a little surprised that she had thought of it, but using his unusual fan, he blocked the attack, joking that he preferred to bathe in warm water. However, he praised her for the effort. With his strength, Doha deflected the flow of water Lariette had directed at him, sending it back toward her. As a result, the main character stood soaked, glaring at Doha in frustration and demanding another chance. Clearly, she wasn't satisfied with her performance. Later that evening, Lariette returned home. The butler noticed her late arrival and commented on it. Lariette, feeling exhausted, asked where Essa was. The butler explained that the Duke was in the bathroom, having arrived in a strange state. Lariette, now deep in thought, considered that perhaps tonight she could start attending to his lower half. Only then did it dawn on her that she would have to touch his bare skin, and the realization made Lariette choke on her saliva. She realized now was the perfect time to proceed while Issa was still in a robe. Cleansing would be easier. So, she hurried toward him as fast as she could. The Duke, just leaving the bath, had been lost in thought, wondering how he could steal a kiss from his beloved when she suddenly appeared, startling him. He blushed, quickly trying to cover himself as if he were completely naked, and even took a step back from her. But Lariette closed the distance, standing almost chest to chest with him. Asrahan, his face flushing, nervously told her she was too close. Without warning, Lariette pushed him to the floor with one hand, grinning as she crawled between his legs. She asked if he was ready for her to begin cleansing the lower part of his body, and suggested starting with his knees. Asrahan, flustered, quickly scooted back and begged her not to do it now. "Does this seem strange to you?" Lariette asked, her tone suddenly serious. She explained that this was a necessary process and asked him to take it seriously. She then touched his knees, causing him to flinch as if he'd been scolded. As she began the cleansing, Lariette realized that the curse in this part of his body was particularly strong. Yet, she found that using magic felt easier than before, all thanks to Doha's guidance. When she finished, she looked up to tell Issa, but his expression made her blush. Sweat dripped down his face, his eyes and cheeks flushed red. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, and it was clear he was struggling to contain himself. Then, as if drawn by some unseen force, Lariette's gaze lowered and her mouth fell open as she noticed his body's reaction to her touch. Embarrassed, she quickly looked away, too ashamed to meet his eyes or glance downward. Suddenly, Issa reached for her, attempting to kiss her. Lariette, stuttering and turning her head, reminded him that kissing was forbidden, but he no longer cared. He gently turned her face toward him and kissed her tenderly on the lips. For a few seconds, Lariette stared at him, conflicted, but soon gave in. However, the kiss didn't last long. After a few moments, Issa flipped her over and hovered above her, gazing into her eyes before kissing her again, this time holding her shoulders. She could feel the weight of his body pressing against hers, and though he stopped for a brief moment, it wasn't for that reason. Breathing heavily, Issa asked if he was ready to sleep with her, then nervously inquired if he could kiss her again. Without waiting for a response, he began covering her neck in soft kisses. Lariette lay still, unsure of what to do, realizing that this could be their first night together. She suddenly sat up and wrapped her arms around his neck. Issa, initially shocked, soon returned the embrace, holding her gently. Before long, her clothes lay discarded beside her, leaving her in only a nightdress. Feeling exposed and embarrassed, she glanced at her lover, who gazed at her in awe, calling her incredibly beautiful as he began to remove his robe. But then he hesitated, wondering if it would disgust her to be intimate with him while his body still bore the curse. Perhaps they should wait until he was fully cleansed? As if reading his mind, Lariette reached out, placing her hands on his face. She assured him he was nothing less than charming, pulling him into a kiss. She added that there wasn't a single ugly part on his body. Only then did Asrahan start to believe her words. Pulling his gaze from her lips, the Duke wrapped his arms around her tightly. She was his entire world now, his saviour. He inhaled the scent of her hair as she playfully pulled him back onto the bed. Smiling, Lariette invited him to continue what they had started. Issa didn't hesitate. He leaned down to kiss her again, knowing they had the whole night ahead of them, a night that belonged only to them. Their bodies were united, perhaps changing something between them forever. The setting was perfect. The lamp dimly illuminated the room as their fingers intertwined, joining in a dance of love. Sometime later, when it was all over, Asher watched Lariette lying motionless, completely exhausted. Noticing her condition, he asked if it had really been that tiring. She, a bit weak, asked if it was obvious. Embarrassed, the Duke acknowledged that it was already early morning, but then shyly asked if they could do it again. Lariette, hearing this, gasped in surprise, exclaiming that she would die if they did. Her face wore a sweet yet pitiful expression. Asher, looking at her with sad, pleading eyes, begged for just one more time. With a sigh, she turned her head away, closed her eyes, then unexpectedly pulled him closer by his robe, agreeing, but only for once. She kissed him again, and at his request, they joined once more in a dance of love. By the afternoon, Lariette made her way to Count Osmond's mansion, where Princess Elizabeth was joyfully waiting for her. Greeting her warmly, Lariette bowed and thanked the princess for inviting her to tea. The princess, indignant, reminded her to simply call her Eliza. Lariette quickly corrected herself, thanking her again, which made the princess smile. Stroking Larette's head, she called her smart, causing the girl to blush in embarrassment. The princess explained that this gathering was with her closest friends and mentioned that she would love to introduce Lariette to them, adding that they were all good people. Lariette smiled and expressed her hope that she would like them. As the princess straightened Larette's hair, she smiled and asked teasingly, "Who wouldn't like you?" This flustered Lariette even more. When they reached the gathering, everyone was already waiting. Among them was Lady Sherbet Genevieve, who ran a popular boutique, Wana Huzan, the eldest daughter of Count Houseman, a daring redhead, and lastly, Sharia Mershin, a sweet, angelic-looking girl with blonde hair and red eyes. The girls introduced themselves and exchanged names, but then Sharia suddenly asked, since Lariette had introduced herself without a last name, if that meant she was a commoner. The room fell silent at the question. It was an awkward moment. Lariette had left her family and chosen to go by no last name, making it difficult to explain. Wana quickly intervened, turning to Sharia and advising her to watch her tongue. The princess also chimed in, calling Sharia's comment rude. Sharia, now embarrassed, apologized, explaining that she had only recently made her debut in society. Lariette, though tense, reassured her that it was fine, though she couldn't tell if Sharia's comment had been intentional or not. The atmosphere soon lightened again, with the girls laughing and discussing their own matters over tea. As the afternoon passed, it was time for them to say their goodbyes. Before she could leave, Lady Wana discreetly pulled Lariette aside. Wana explained that what she was about to say would be awkward to discuss behind someone's back, but it needed to be said. She informed Lariette that Sharia Merchin had only recently joined them after a failed debut in society, and that Princess Elsa had taken pity on her, bringing her to the group. Wana whispered that it might be wise for Lariette to keep her distance from Sharia for now, as she was still quite ignorant of the ways of high society. But ultimately, it was up to Lariette to decide. Wana reassured her that Lady Osmond was not a bad person, but insisted she was simply giving a friendly warning, expressing her concern that more awkward situations could arise if Sharia wasn't careful. Just as Wana finished speaking, someone called out to Lariette. Turning around, she saw a familiar face, Asher, heading straight toward her. When Asher reached her, he smiled sweetly, like a puppy seeking its master's attention. The girls at the table were stunned, their mouths agape as they watched the scene unfold. Asher noticed their stares and quickly straightened up, his expression shifting to something more composed. He greeted the ladies politely before putting his arm around Larette's shoulders, declaring that he would take her home. Lariette quickly said her goodbyes to the group and left with Asher. The princess watched them leave, still in shock, unable to understand what had come over Asher. Once inside the carriage, Lariette turned to Asher and asked if he had to return to the imperial castle today. Asher answered yes, a bit sadly, adding that he wished he could spend more time with her. Lariette, not discouraged, responded that she had plans anyway. They exchanged glances for a few moments, and then, unexpectedly, Lariette leaned in and kissed Duke Candle, gently holding his face in her hands. He resisted at first, asking her to wait, but soon gave in. He placed an arm around her back, gently lowering her into a reclining position. However, as she tried to pull away, Asher didn't allow it. Looking up at her, he remarked that he had never considered it before, but the carriage didn't seem like such a bad place after all. Intertwining his fingers with hers, Lariette finally realized what he meant. Stuttering, she asked for clarification, but Asher only pulled her into another kiss. Then, with a grin, he teased her, asking if she had kissed him without intending to follow through. Pulling back slightly, Asher smirked and said she deserved some sort of punishment for teasing him. Lariette was caught off guard, not by his words, but by his breathtaking beauty. Her conscience suddenly chided her, reminding her how she had agreed that the carriage was indeed a good place. Lost in her thoughts, she was jolted back to reality when the coachman's voice called out, announcing their arrival. Startled, Lariette quickly escaped the carriage and hurried into the street, leaving Asher behind. He remained sitting on the floor, laughing at the whole situation. As he stood, he called out after her, teasingly shouting that they would finish what they started once they were home. Turning back to him, Lariette replied that in that case, she'd have to move to another room. Arriving at her destination, Lariette spotted Doha standing in the middle of the street, waiting for her. Noticing his attire was different from usual, she complimented him, to which he smiled and asked if he looked unusual today. She couldn't help but admire how Doha looked like a work of art, almost as if he were sent from heaven. The man, seemingly unaware of the effect he had on her, smiled and explained that it wasn't a coincidence they met here today. They were going to practice secrecy. Hearing this, Lariette felt inspired and eagerly thanked Doha, praising him as amazing. Then, with a playful tone, she added that she loved him. The comment, though meant in jest, flustered Doha. He froze, his face turning red as he covered it with his hands, clearly confused by his own reaction. Lariette, now curious, only wanted to know where they would start. After regaining his composure, Doha suggested they begin by practicing how to blend into the crowd unnoticed. He then detailed the spell they would use, explaining everything thoroughly. Lariette listened carefully and, after a few moments, successfully cast the spell. Smiling, she took Doha's hands, looked into his eyes, and asked if she had done everything correctly.